Mr. Speaker, it is genuinely a great honour to speak on behalf of Her Majesty's opposition to mark Armistice Day in this debate and the centenary in the end of what was then the greatest military conflict the world has ever seen. It is both a privilege and a duty shared by all of us to honour the sacrifice of all those who served in that war. And today I want to talk of remembrance, but also of reconciliation, of internationalism, conflict resolution and the lessons of war, and I'd like to touch on the work of some of the institutions that support our veterans and honour the memory of the fallen. Remembrance Day and the poppies so many of us are wearing today have come to symbolise not just the sacrifices of the Great War, but the sacrifices made in all wars by all who play a part in them. I remember when I was a child, many of the veterans of the Great War were still with us, and the veterans of the Second World War, my grandparents' generation, didn't even seem old, although they seemed old to me at the time. Today, all of those who served between 1914 and 1918 have passed away, and even the number of Second World War veterans is dwindling. Now, just over a decade ago, I was privileged to play a part, along with the Right Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford Green and other members of this House, in efforts to ensure that the last great British war veteran, the last Tommy to pass away, was properly honoured, whoever that last veteran might have been. Harry Patch, the last surviving British soldier to have fought in the trenches, died in 2009. Claude Choules, the last English-born Great War combat veteran who served in the Royal Navy, died in 2011. Florence Green, the last surviving Great War service veteran, died in 2012. And with them, the Great War passed irreversibly from living memory to history. And as the Honourable Member for Gainsborough said in his intervention, it is the responsibility of all of us to continue to recognise the sacrifice that that generation made and to learn the lessons of history. No organisation has done more to recognise the sacrifice and the contribution of that First World War generation than the Royal British Legion. The Legion was formed just after the war. The poppy of Flanders Fields is their emblem. But they don't just commemorate. They also run impressive modern campaigns relevant to today's veterans too, providing them with the financial and emotional and psychological support. The Legion are desperately short of members. People think you have to be a veteran to join. You don't. And it is a pleasure to see so many civilians in my own constituency of West Bromwich East supporting this important organisation. And as the Secretary of State alluded to, this year the Legion's commemoration is particularly poignant. And we welcome the special Caddy poppies that honour the 74,000 Indian soldiers that lost their lives fighting for Britain. We also remember the gold-leafed poppies that specifically commemorate the centenary of the war, which has been produced by the Legion this year. What is most remarkable about them is not just the inspiring work they do in the weeks that are leading up to Remembrance Sunday. It's the work they do all year round, reminding all of us that remembrance is something we should do all year round. And Armistice Day has always been a bittersweet commemoration in this country. Sweet because, of course, it marks the end of a war which scarred Europe and the world, the end of 4 years of industrialised killing, the like of which had never seen before. Sweet because for Britain and our allies it celebrates a victory against a war of aggression by Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so it was celebrated at the time. When the news of the armistice came through, cheering crowds gathered in every town square. There was dancing and singing, and church bells rang out for the first time in 4 years. It is fitting that bell ringing, not just in this country, but around the world, is part of this year's centenary commemorations. And yet it is far more bitter than sweet. Armistice Day is always a solemn event of reflection and remembrance, and it is treated as such in wreath-laying ceremonies at memorials all over the country, which honourable and right honourable members from across this House will be attending in their constituencies this weekend. Millions of men never came home. Nearly 1 million British dead alone, lying alongside hundreds of thousands from what was then the British Empire. Millions more returned with physical or psychological injuries and with memories of the friends and comrades they left behind in the trenches of Flanders and the Somme, in Turkey and Palestine, in the Atlantic and the North Sea. Of 14,000 parishes in England and Wales, only 50 saw all their soldiers come home, and every single community in Scotland and Ireland lost at least someone. Many places lost far more. The small village of Wadhurst in East Sussex lost 25 men in a single day in 1915, and 149 men altogether over the course of the war, from a total of just 3,500. The so-called PALS battalions, made up of men from a particular local area, especially from our industrial towns and cities serving alongside each other, often suffered losses whose impact on their community is almost unthinkable and unimaginable today. Take just one of many more examples. On the 1st of July 1916, the opening day of the Battle of the Somme, 235 members of the Accrington PALS, the 11th Service Battalion of the East Lancashire Regiment, were killed, and 350 wounded in the space of just 20 minutes. The fighting continued right up until literally the last few seconds before the armistice was signed. More men died in 1918 than in any previous year of the war. The last British serviceman to be killed, Private George Edwin Ellison, died just 1.5 hours before the armistice on the outskirts of Mons in Belgium, almost exactly the same place where British forces had first seen action in 1914. Indeed, George Ellison's grave now faces that of John Parr, the first British soldier killed during that conflict. And between the death of John Parr in August 1914 and George Ellison in November 1918, 1.1 million British service personnel lost their lives, more than in any other conflict before or since. Almost every city and town and village in Britain has a war memorial listing those who never returned from the Great War. And thanks to the work of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, the brave men and women who lost their lives during the war are remembered with gravestones and memorials across the world. And I know the whole House would like to thank the gardeners and staff of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, who do so much to ensure that our service personnel are honoured in fitting resting places. And yet perhaps the bitterest element of this bittersweet commemoration is, as the Honourable Member for Chingford and Woodford said, is almost all of those war memorials have another plaque or another set of carvings listing those who never returned from the Second World War, less than 3 decades later. The Armistice Day hopes of Lloyd George were dashed. Whatever else we might want to say about what was described as the war to end all wars, it turned out not to be the war to end all wars. The Great War was perhaps the last war in which people signed up to fight out of deference and patriotic fervour. We've all seen the photos of lines of young men, some of them perhaps lying about their age, desperate to join up and see action before the end of a war they believed would be over by Christmas. But in quite a short time, those deferential and patriotic sentiments were not enough to meet the needs of the military in a war on this scale, which is why conscription had to be introduced in 1916. The horrors of the Western Front made many in Britain doubt whether the war was worth it. It was not only in this country that the success of the war effort relied on popular support. Russia's experience on the Eastern Front, the gradual breakdown of its economy and the Russian people's discontent with its leadership was a direct cause of the Russian Revolution, which shaped global politics for the rest of the century and beyond. The mutinies of 1917 crippled the effectiveness of the French army. America's entry into the war, which contributed so much to the Allied victory, might not have been possible at all without the popular outrage generated by the German U-boat campaign sinking US civilian shipping. And the final German collapse owed much to the suffering of its population under the British naval blockade. Leaders and generals do not operate in isolation, cold-bloodedly moving around blocks of troops disconnected from the societies from which those troops are drawn. Political leaders have to earn and secure support for any military action, not just at the start, but on an ongoing basis. That's a lesson which has to be learned again and again, from Algeria to Vietnam to Iraq. The Great War changed Britain forever in so many ways. And this year we've also been celebrating the centenary of many women getting the vote. Another momentous event in the momentous year of 1918. The achievement of women's suffrage had many causes, and the movement long preceded the Great War, and achieving the vote was just one step on a path towards equality that still stretches before us. But the contribution of women to that war effort, in filling roles previously reserved for the men now fighting overseas, helped to solidify the argument that women were just as capable as men and had just as much right to political representation, and made progress faster than it might otherwise have been. In some ways, and I realise this could be controversial, Britain was lucky in 1918. Unlike France and Belgium, it was not scarred with bomb craters and ruined towns. Unlike Russia, it had no revolution or civil war. Unlike Germany, it had no reparations to pay or territory to concede. But its people bore the scars of war on their bodies and in their minds. They deserved and needed what Lloyd George promised them, a land fit for heroes. Instead, they got nearly 2 decades of economic slump, unemployment, poverty, poor housing, and the Great Depression. Both then and now, Britain has not always treated its service personnel with the respect they deserve. And as a defence minister, I met Gertie, the daughter of Private Harry Farr, and her daughter Janet Booth, who campaigned tirelessly for a pardon for their father and grandfather who was shot at dawn for cowardice. Harry Farr was no coward. It was the dignity of his family whose tireless campaign led to the pardons for the shot at dawn generation. And I'm proud of the role in righting what I saw as an injustice of the 306 soldiers my honourable friend mentioned, when many of them had clearly been suffering from what was then called shell shock and what would now be called post-traumatic stress disorder. Their families were not entitled to a military pension and often faced great hardship. Granting them a pardon did not change what was done to them, but it eased the stigma felt by their loved ones over the generations. And anybody that has ever visited the National Memorial Arboretum to see the commemoration to those that were shot at dawn cannot fail to be moved. And we should pay tribute, Mr. Speaker, to the work of the National Memorial Arboretum in the West Midlands that allows so many to pay their respects to the men and women of our armed forces. As a young minister, newly in post, I remember feeling my heart in my mouth when I had to give what is called a ministerial direction to underwrite the cost of the magnificent Armed Forces Memorial that was opened by Her Majesty the Queen in October 2007 to honour the sacrifice of those that have lost their lives in service in more than 50 operations and conflicts since the Second World War. Now today, we understand the impact of war better than we did 100 years ago. And with a smaller professional military, we do not have to face the challenge of reintegrating millions of ex-service personnel into the civilian economy. But we do owe a duty of care to veterans and their families that lasts beyond the last echo of gunfire. That has to include physical and mental health support, as well as efforts to ensure that they have the skills they need to find civilian employment. Both the Great War and what came after it show us the need for internationalism. It was rival nationalisms that caused the war, rival imperial ambitions, rival insecurities, the escalation of responses to perceived threats until it was easier for the great powers to go to war than for them to back down from it. There can be no greater failure of diplomacy than the resort to armed conflict, even if armed conflict sometimes is the right response to a failure of diplomacy. And once the causes of the failure of the armistice to hold was the disastrously punitive terms imposed on Germany by the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 and its insistence on German war guilt, which both crippled its economy and fed the resentment which the Nazis were able to harness so effectively. As Marshal Foch prophetically said, Versailles was not a peace treaty, but an armistice for 20 years. And after the Great War, the world failed to build a sustainable peace. The post-war League of Nations was a well-intentioned attempt to stop such a thing happening again, but it proved inadequate to the task of responding to the nationalism, fascism, and territorial ambition of Hitler and Mussolini, to Soviet expansionism, or indeed to America First isolationism. The failure of the League of Nations showed the need for stronger international institutions. And since the Second World War, for all their flaws, institutions including the United Nations, NATO and the European Union have helped us to avoid any repeat of war on a global scale, even if they've been unable to prevent a myriad of smaller conflicts. Building lasting, sustainable peace is not easy, but it requires a commitment to internationalism, a commitment to development, diplomacy, and the fostering of economic ties between nations. Where necessary, it requires conflict resolution, but also a strong defence posture and a willingness to countenance military intervention as a last resort, but not as a first step, and a framework of international laws and justice. Too many of these were absent in the aftermath of the Great War, and the whole world paid a terrible price for the fragility of the armistice. Mr. Speaker, if ever there is a time to forgive and reunite, then it is the 11th of November 2018. This year, of all the articles written on the Great War, one that moved me the most was that written by Lord Michael Ashcroft, who made the case that courage is something that is displayed by service personnel on both sides of war and conflict. We should never forget that. He made a strong case for reconciliation in his tribute to the courage of Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron. Now, there was controversy last month when the government revealed its plans to invite the German head of state to the cenotaph. But it strikes me that in this year, 100 years after men and women of courage gave their lives fighting for their countries, in the spirit of reconciliation and peace, we should honour the valour and sacrifice of our opponents in the Great War by inviting the German president to share in our remembrance. And the Secretary of State was absolutely right to make that commitment. Mr. Speaker, I am grateful to have had the opportunity to speak in this important debate today, and to colleagues for their thoughtful and humane interventions. We owe so much to all of those who served and all those who gave us their lives in the Great War that ended on the 11th of November 1918. 100 years later, they still have much to teach us. And as the Bishop of Lambeth said in his address to us in that very moving service, war starts in the hearts and minds and souls of men and women like us. And peace, too, starts in the hearts and minds and souls of men and women like us. Let us not just speak of peace, but let each and every one of us in this house be the peacemakers. Yeah.